All right, well, welcome to Unit 10. We're going to talk about why nations trade, globalization, how we measure development in a nation, to kind of see if they're getting their needs and wants met. It kind of goes back to Unit 2, which is really our first unit, where we discuss the issue of scarcity. And when nations don't have all of the natural resources that they need, we call that land, then they're kind of forced to trade. And so when we ask that question, why do nations trade? That's the big issue of scarcity and the idea that resources are scarce. So you trade with other nations. And what we'll find in this unit is that specialization is a very important topic. When a nation can specialize, then they have more of an opportunity to trade for the things that they don't specialize in with a nation that maybe does specialize in those other areas. And so what a nation tries to do is to get an advantage. And so you're going to talk about absolute and comparative advantages. And the nation is always better off when it has a comparative advantage. And the key component here is a comparative advantage means that they have a lower opportunity cost when they are choosing what to make with the goods that they happen to have. And so they can produce a product more efficiently when they have a lower opportunity cost. In other words, they give up less to make one product instead of choosing to do another product where they might have to give up a little bit more. And so the law of comparative advantage is going to be very important as we move forward. And so this slide goes into a little bit on what a comparative advantage is, looking at David Ricardo's quote, who is a classical economist. And then giving you a breakdown between Carlos and Jenny. If they were nations making either t-shirts or birdhouses, you can kind of look through there and see what it is they give up, what the opportunity cost would be. And the one that has the lower opportunity cost would choose to do that. So this allows nations basically to specialize in a limited number of goods, but they can then trade and consume a greater variety. And so that's kind of the goal here. Now, when you specialize, that affects, of course, jobs. And you're going to hear a lot about jobs when it comes to globalization and trade, especially when we talk about the issue of offshoring or outsourcing, where companies are hiring people from other nations to do work usually more cheaply, which lowers their production cost, which allows them to then provide the goods at a cheaper price for consumers because they're still covering their cost. Now you can see kind of what our top exports are, what we send out into the world. Capital goods tend to be the biggest category, and then followed by industrial supplies. But, when we send out jobs, especially through offshoring, the impact of trade, it's going to cause people either have to relocate, be unemployed, take a lower paying job, or they're going to have to go back to school and get new skills, maybe go through a training program. But to compete globally, this is what's happening, and we're seeing this a lot. And in the last election, jobs was a big component of that campaign on both sides. And so what we do is as we're trying to protect jobs, or American interest in our case, every nation's going to be thinking about their own people. We're going to engage a lot of times in what's called protectionism. And this idea that we're going to use, what we're going to introduce here is trade barriers. And what these are is we try to put barriers in front of other people, other nations, to keep an advantage in our court. So we want to protect jobs would be the number one reason. Number two would be protecting what we call infant industries, industries that are pretty new, that just can't compete yet with the global competition. And three, if anything that we produce would have national security implications, we would try to put up trade barriers. And what trade barriers are, as you can see there, it's just a restriction that prevents a foreign product or service from freely entering a nation's territory. So we might introduce tariffs where we tax imported goods. We might put quotas on certain imports and say, well, you can only bring a certain amount of your particular good into the United States to sell. Well, if there's fewer products that they can sell, they're going to have to charge more to make up the difference, which would raise the price on foreign goods and give an advantage to American goods. Then they can do the same to us when they import our goods. VERs, voluntary export restraint. A nation might choose to voluntarily restrain the number of goods that they send into another country, raising the limit, but it may be that it gives them more of an advantage there. Having business licenses, any kind of health, safety, environmental regulations can cause a form of barrier. Sanctions. We might sanction another nation. This is an action to punish them. We've done this to Iran, for instance, or Cuba. An embargo where we ban all trade, where we make it illegal for anyone associated with the United States to participate in any kind of trade with another nation. It would restrict our companies from doing business with them, and the idea is to enact change. A lot of times we do this with nations that we don't agree with, maybe their human rights record or those sorts of things. Usually this results in a higher price on foreign goods, and this can also result in a trade war, which is just kind of the back and forth of another nation that we're punishing through trade barriers will then turn around and try to do the same to us, and then we'll retaliate again and so forth. And that usually just means, again, higher prices, less opportunity to have more goods and services. We can also do the opposite. We can restrict or remove barriers, I should say, and do what's called a trade agreement, where we try to introduce free trade, removing those barriers so that nations don't have them getting in the way of trading these goods or services that we're producing with our resources. And so the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs in 1948 was passed, GATT, trying to reduce tariffs and stabilize world trade. The idea that, free trade will help nations get along. This is right after World War II. You can see there, though, that for nearly 50 years, GATT was not terribly effective, and so by 1995, the World Trade Organization was introduced to try to enforce the provisions of GATT. So some of the trade agreements that we discuss are, of course, the European Union. This is 28 nations. This is before Britain voted to leave the EU, and they're still in the process of that. And a lot of them, 18 of them, you can see adopted the single currency of the euro, where they would use one currency instead of all the member nations' individual currencies. This is the idea of making things easier to cross the European borders into the various countries, making trade easier. We did something similar with NAFTA, which stands for North American Free Trade Agreement. This was between the United States, Mexico, and Canada, and you can see some of the provisions there. And there's some others, as you can see, that are down there, and as you look through the textbook, you'll be able to get more details on those. You can see the opposing views on trade, why we might want to produce and encourage more trade agreements, and why we might want to engage in more protectionism. And you can see in elections, politicians will argue, usually for one or the other, or sometimes even a combination of both, depending on what's happening in the world and how that would help give an advantage, especially for the U.S. goods or jobs. So exchange rates become important because as we trade, we're going to have to engage in trying to value what our imports or exports are worth, and are we getting fair trade based on that. And so it's going to be very important that we be able to value goods on a system that allows us to kind of take in mind what each currency is worth. And so there's two types of currencies. We get values of currency through what's called a fixed exchange rate system, and this is usually for more developing nations. Less developed countries will try to attach their currency and fix it to a more stable currency of a larger nation, like the U.S. dollar or maybe the European Union euro. So if the dollar, let's say, goes up a certain percentage in value, their currency would do the same, and so it's one way to just provide some stability. Now, the larger nations and usually the more developed nations are going to use what's called a flexible exchange rate system. That means it can change daily. These currencies are traded on the open market, sort of like stocks. So there is some up and down to it, but there is a pretty consistent flexibility, I would say, with the flexible exchange rate. So the dollar, tends to be, even though it might weaken from time to time or strengthen from time to time, it's still consistently a solid currency that most nations will trust, mainly because they trust that the U.S. government's stable, and therefore, since it is fiat money, we're just declaring that it has value. It has nothing backing it. The supply and demand of our currencies is pretty stable, and so the flexible exchange rate system reflects that, even though there is some up and down. This also affects our balance of trade, the relationship of imports and exports. We tend to run a trade deficit, and so it would obviously be better if we ran a trade surplus, meaning we're selling more of our goods than what we're purchasing from other nations. But we do pretty well on both ends of that, but we tend to run a deficit. So you can see here kind of the effect of the exchange rate on trade, and so please look through that. And that kind of gets us into development. We're going to look at various indicators to see where a nation is in the spectrum of getting most of their needs and wants met for their people. And so when we measure development, we're trying to get a sense of, are people meeting their basic needs, and beyond that, are they able to then start to obtain goods and services that help them meet their wants. And so when we say the word developed nation, we're talking about nations with high average of material well-being. Less developed nations tend to have low levels, and you can see different examples. And there's a third category where you have nations that are less developed, but they're moving along that spectrum, and they're getting close to being developed, but they're not quite there in all of the measurements. So we call those newly industrialized countries. And so you can see some of the barriers that would keep a nation from fully developing. And so if a nation finds itself in this place, they're going to have to try to find the means to move along that spectrum. This usually will involve foreign aid. If they can't internally finance through the savings of their own citizens, they'll have to look abroad and try to find the means. So here's some of the developmental indicators that we look at, and you can kind of look and see the difference between both groups. To promote development, a few important groups: the World Bank, the UNDP, and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. Know those, as well as other non-government organizations, what we call NGOs. Then finally, we're going to talk about some nations that are going to move along the spectrum of having a centrally planned economy. Usually they'll start to privatize and move more towards a free market economy. Just remember that all nations have a mixed economy. You'll read about China using special economic zones to try to entice nations to send their companies over and bring jobs, such as Apple building iPhones in China, for instance. They can participate in these special zones where they can get tax incentives and things, so that they don't have to necessarily play by the rules that the rest of the Chinese companies do. And so it's brought a lot of foreign investment into their country. And so you'll see nations do things like that. And so as we move further into globalization, just realize that, it's all going back to the first thing we talked about, which is dealing with the issue of scarcity and trying to make it easier to get goods and services produced so that they can meet their needs and wants. Here's some challenges of globalization. So note some of these terms, especially as it relates to migration with brain drain. We talked a little bit about outsourcing, and You can see a little bit about how the U.S. is affected here. And then finally, the circular flow model. If you go back to John Maynard Keynes' view of this, as we, for instance, send jobs overseas, you would see this affecting the factor market, where instead of American households providing the physical flow of labor and getting paychecks, monetary flow in return, a lot of this might be headed out overseas, and this is the concern that you'll see during elections, for instance, where they emphasize more protectionism, trying to get that money flowing back to U.S. households. So you can look at the circular flow and see the effect in both the product and the factor market. And so that's Unit 10, so please let me know if you have any questions.